Hello and welcome to this keynote session forming part of the 12th Annual Analysys Mason Telecoms Summit. My name is David McElroy and I work as part of Analysys Mason's online events team. Now you may have already watched some other sessions leading up to this one. However, I just wanted to remind you of a few points that will help you to get the most out of this and all of our other summit presentations. Firstly, remember that all sessions are available on demand, meaning that you can access them in an order and at a time and a date that suits you. We have a selection of keynote and breakout sessions for you to choose from, and you can access all of them via the event homepage. Once you have entered your chosen session, you have the ability to connect with the presenters, access and download useful resources, and submit questions. As this session is on demand, our presenters will get back to you in the coming days regarding any questions, and they will do so directly by email. Now, once this session has ended, you'll be automatically redirected to the event homepage and invited to select another session. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Principal Analyst Michelle McKenzie. So over to you, Michelle, when you're ready.
Thanks, David. So my name's Michelle McKenzie. As David said, I'm a Principal Analyst and I'm work on our Operator Business Services team, and I focus on private networks. So today, for this presentation, I'm going to focus on some of the challenges we see with growing the private networks market. Early adopters of private networks have the necessary resources to deploy what are relatively expensive bespoke solutions. And these are the sort of solutions that service providers are offering today. So for the private networks opportunity to grow and scale, they'll need to reach a much broader audience of enterprises, and today's current solutions are out of reach of that broader audience. So I'm going to discuss some of the challenges with that. So to begin, let's just define what we mean by a private network. That will ensure we're all on the same page as I go through the presentation. So a private LTE or 5G network is a cellular network that's built specifically for an individual enterprises. And such networks, they're most commonly deployed on a single site. So for example, in a factory or in a mine. Our definition would include a radio access network, a core network, and of course the spectrum. And these can be deployed either as a fully dedicated on-premise solution or possibly as a private slice of a public network, but they're designated for the sole use of an individual enterprise. So that's our definition. We're not including Wi-Fi or any other technologies purely focused on cellular networks. Now, just to provide a little bit of context around the private networks market, so we can see that the private networks market is growing. The data on this slide, I should clarify, is taken from Analysys Mason's private networks tracker. And we track the enterprise contracts that are publicly announced, so they're in the public domain. We're aware that there are many more networks deployed, but many of them are not public, so we don't have the data about them. But this information, in any case, provides a useful indicator of how the market is growing and progressing. So at Q2 2022, in our tracker, we had recorded 323 contracts in the public domain. And as you can see here, growth was strong between 2018 and 2021. But as we get to 2022, growth appears to be slowing. Now, this may be because fewer contracts have been announced, but we've also had reports from some vendors that it's taking longer to finalize some of the contracts. So this may be an indication of some of the challenges that the market is facing in moving beyond the early adopters, which are large enterprises, to reach a much broader audience of enterprises. So today, it's mainly large enterprises, as I said, that are investing in private networks. And to understand why these enterprises are investing, I want to consider four key areas: cost, complexity, use cases, and support. So let's start with cost. So for these large enterprises, these early adopters, affordability is not an issue. Large enterprises have the financial resources to invest in cellular networks. And remember, these networks are typically more expensive than some alternatives, such as Wi-Fi. Companies are willing to invest because other technologies cannot support the high-end use cases that they want to deploy. And in addition, these companies are usually able to support the ownership model for the network. So that's a traditional CapEx and OpEx model. And early adopter industries have the internal resources to build the business case. Of course, they'll look to partners for support, but they are pioneers in a new market and are willing to assume some risk. Let's move to complexity. So these enterprises deploy highly bespoke solutions that are customized for their needs. They're not easily deterred by the complexity involved in sourcing appropriate network components from a range of different suppliers. And they have some of the resources and skills to identify and source those components to piece together some of the solutions, but also work with a range of partners for those aspects that they can't address internally. And they'll often, typically they'll work with a main contractor, but they tend to be involved in the process. If we move to use cases, large enterprises have the technical and financial expertise to build the business case for new use cases. And sometimes those use cases will form part of a broader enterprise digital transformation strategy. But typically, early adopters are mainly looking to support new use cases on their private network that will allow greater automation of business processes. They use the network to monitor and control new applications, and they're rarely, at least not in the first instance, deploying private networks to migrate existing applications onto the network. And some have their own internal capabilities to build the use cases, but they also work with application developers and system integration partners. And then if we move to the last aspect, which is the support, while large enterprises have IT teams, they may even have specialist network teams to manage the network internally. And some may choose some may choose to outsource some elements of that network management to a third party. But essentially, network management is not a prohibitor for them in terms of cost or lack of skills. So we'll use these 4 points as a framework for analysing the rest of the debate around selling private networks. I think also it's important to show that, large enterprises, they have clear motivations for adopting private networks, and we've conducted a number of interviews with end users during the course of our research. Now, these quotes here on this slide illustrate why some of the factors on the previous slide are not potential barriers for early adopters of private networks. So let's take the first one. Private network is 3 to 5 times more expensive than other alternatives, but when latency is high, our cost of production is high. So in order to reduce that, we want to use the best network, and that for us is private 5G, and that reduced the costs of manufacturing time. So this first quote was taken from an interview with a German car manufacturer, and the main takeaway here is that the relatively high cost of the private network is more than compensated by the increase in productivity and the resulting profitability. So the real benefits of private 5G are very evident in the manufacturing sector, where enterprises seek to automate more and more manual processes. And let's have a look at the second one. So having our own private network means we can enjoy high availability, high reliability, low latency, etc. So this second quote references the attributes of the network that are considered important for new use cases. And this interview highlighted that early adopters are deploying private 5G to achieve results that are just sort of not possible with other technologies. So I'll talk a little bit now about Hub One. Hub One is an early adopter of private networks, and it has deployed private LTE network at the 3 Parisian airports. So it announced in 2020 that it would deploy a private LTE 5G network at Paris-Charles de Gaulle, Paris-Orly, and Paris-Le Bourget airports. And that's in collaboration with its parent company, Group ADP, which owns the airports, and Air France. So let's just think about this deployment in relation to those 4 areas that I mentioned. So in terms of cost, Hub One has not said how much it paid for the private network. However, it's deployed a relatively large network, 140 base stations, spanning 55 square kilometers. So we would expect this sort of network to cost in the range of several million euros, if not tens of million euros. Now, Hub One is a wholly owned subsidiary of Group ADP, and that's a relatively large company that develops and manages airports, and its revenue was 2.1 billion euros in 2020. And Hub One itself, which is the systems integration arm, generated 136 million euros in 2020. So we can assume on this basis that the cost of the private network would probably not be a prohibitor. And Hub One has assumed some of the risk in that it plans to monetize the network among the different businesses at the airport. So I think this is in addition to the airline. And it's going to offer those businesses access to the network. But initially, at least, it's difficult to calculate the operational benefits for each of those different stakeholders. So Hub One has assumed some of that risk. Over time, it will put metrics in place to evaluate how to monetize the network. If we move to complexity, so Hub One has the resource and expertise to source the different components of the network and identify relevant solutions partners. So it's a specialist telecom systems integrator, and it has many of the relevant skills to install and manage the network. And it's working with Ericsson, who is the prime contractor here. And Ericsson supplies the radio network and has supported in terms of network design and build. But interestingly, Hub One sourced the core network from Athernet. So it wanted a sort of smaller enterprise-ready core network. And we can speculate that deploying a core network from a different supplier to the radio network must have added another layer of complexity in terms of integration and interoperability. But presumably this was something that Hub One could address. And in addition, Hub One sourced its own spectrum. So it was granted 40 megahertz of spectrum in the 2.6 gigahertz TDD band. So Hub One has been able to source different components to build this private network. And complexity, it's had the resources to address that. Then in terms of use cases, so a big driver for deploying the private network was to support new use cases. And the company is sort of building and trialing lots of different work process related to the aircraft, so including refueling, aircraft maintenance, baggage handling, etc. So lots of new use cases that it believes it can support more efficiently on a private cellular network rather than Wi-Fi. And that's probably not typical of early adopters. I mean, typically, they're looking at 1 or 2 use cases initially. And then, of course, in terms of support, while Hub One is a systems integrator, and its core business is about building and managing those sort of networks on behalf of its customers. So if we take a look now at the size of the private networks market and look at, how much is at stake here. So the number of private networks will grow very quickly at a CAGR of 65% between 2021 and 2027 to reach 39,000 networks. Enterprise spend, so that's CapEx and OpEx on private networks, will reach around $7.7 billion US. And that's, again, is going to grow relatively quickly. On top of this, enterprises will spend an additional $4.4 billion by 2027 on edge computing and applications related to the private network. So we expect to see that the market will grow strongly from a small base. And of course, this spend is relatively small if we compare it to the public network, but this is all new spend on network equipment. So we believe that spend on private networks has the potential to grow even faster beyond the forecast period, but that will be very dependent on suppliers addressing some of the challenges that the broader enterprise market encounters when looking at private networks. And of course, there are still many challenges, and we see that there is a growing mismatch between demand and supply. So today's complex and expensive private network propositions are going to be out of reach of the vast majority of enterprises. So we've also interviewed end users that have either chosen an alternative technology for private networks, or they're still trying to overcome some of the challenges of deploying a private cellular network. And the contrast that we will see with these quotes compared to those that we looked at earlier is quite stark. So let's take the first one. Private networks are expensive, they don't scale well across our large number of sites, and we can't afford to develop a private network. Cost scale with network scale. So in contrast to the manufacturing quotes that we saw earlier, where they claimed that the investment in a private network was easily justifiable, this utilities company that we interviewed here claims that the business case just doesn't stack up for them. In essence, the cost of the network is prohibitively expensive, but the spokesperson here also makes an interesting point about scalability across multiple sites. Each site could have unique characteristics, of course, in terms of radio planning and network design, but this quote also suggests that the solutions available are just too expensive. Then if we look at the next one, 5G is too complicated and too costly at present. So again, reiterating the point we made on cost. This manufacturer was interested in private 5G, but also was also aware that the solution would probably depend on operator spectrum. And the spokesperson raised concerns that the priorities for operators today would focus on the mass market rollout of 5G and not on enterprise requirements. And they were therefore considering alternative technologies because they didn't think that the right solutions were yet available for enterprises. And then the last one, Wi-Fi is fine for supporting mission-critical processes and will evolve to Wi-Fi 6. For our manufacturing execution system. So this quote, again by a German manufacturer, they chose Wi-Fi 6 over private 5G. and it illustrates that alternative technologies are being considered and adopted to support industrial use cases. And such technologies are often cheaper to deploy and often deemed good enough to support the use cases. And of course, we've heard that cellular is more expensive, but we've heard that it can be anywhere from 50% more expensive to 7 times more expensive than existing solutions. So not many enterprises will have the means to invest if that's the case. So evidently there's a significant mismatch between the needs of enterprises and the solutions that are currently available on the market. And to grow the market to 7.7 billion by 2027 and significantly more beyond that, which we think is possible, suppliers need to address this gap between requirements and what they can currently offer. Enterprises require sort of simpler, affordable solutions with a service wrap that includes support for the network and help with delivering private 5G use cases. So now let's take a look at the different types of suppliers of private networks and what they're doing to address some of these challenges. So on this, we'll start with the network equipment providers, so companies such as Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei, and so on. And obviously, network equipment providers are strong when it comes to the network solution, of course. So they're developing and delivering network functions, the mobile core, the radio access network, which are all designed to work together and obviously eliminate some of the interoperability issues. And they also have the network integration capabilities, although they don't always have a local team of integrators. They do rely on telecoms operators and systems integrators, but they do have that expertise, of course. And so both of these factors, of course, help to overcome some of those problems of complexity. They're bringing to market solutions that are designed to work together. However, the network equipment provider solutions are derived from systems designed for public networks that support millions of subscribers, and therefore they are often overly complex and therefore too expensive for enterprises. Their solutions, of course, are being adopted by early adopters of private networks, but as I have said before, those companies tend to have the internal skills and resource to address that complexity. But their solutions may be out of reach for the broader enterprise market. We don't think the network equipment providers fare so well typically in the area of use cases and support. They don't always have the channel partners in place to provide the ongoing support in terms of managing the network or building and deploying the use cases. And of course, they are supporting some of the early adopters with this, but they're not yet able to deliver that at scale. And especially around edge, some of the services, there might be a tension between the network equipment providers and the needs of businesses. So these providers will want to develop their own capabilities in edge, but businesses will probably want something from the public cloud providers or something based on the public cloud providers. So the network equipment providers need to show how they will work alongside the cloud providers in developing private networks. And the solutions to sit on top of them. And network equipment providers also need to show how their options will be less complex than those from other suppliers. And of course, they are already taking measures to address these challenges. Nokia, for example, has offered its digital automation cloud solution for some years, providing more of a platform-based solution to simplify deployments. And it's recently launched its mission critical industrial edge solution, which provides support for those use cases and so on. And then Ericsson is building out its enterprise channel through its acquisition of Cradlepoint. And this acquisition will broaden its go-to-market strategy and allows it to work with a wider range of channel partners and as well as selling direct to enterprises. So, and indeed, Ericsson has acquired a small sort of core network vendor, Quartus, although we've not yet seen exactly how it plans to integrate Quartus into its offer. So overall, network equipment providers play an important role in creating awareness of the private networks proposition and providing solutions to the market, but they'll need to do more to bring simpler, more affordable solutions to market while continuing to build out their channels. So next, we'll take a look at the operators. So some operators launched private network solutions early and have started to consider new models to address the issues of cost and complexity. So for the dedicated on-premise model, operators are, of course, reselling their partners' equipment. But in this area, they probably have less room to maneuver on pricing. Operators are better placed to differentiate their offers based on the hybrid network deployment model that I mentioned earlier in our definition, in which they provide a private slice of their own network assets. And in theory, the introduction of 5G standalone will fully enable these hybrid architecture deployments. So, and of course, operators can also package the spectrum into their offer. So in terms of cost and complexity, operators have an opportunity to provide a simpler and more cost-effective model. However, this is an emerging model and largely unproven at scale. So, we will see more of this as we go forward. Some operators have systems integration units that have developed software, cloud computing, horizontal platforms, etc. for IoT. They are, in some respects, quite well placed to support use cases. But obviously, that's not the case for all operators. Operators also have their own network operations centers to manage their public networks. It's questionable, however, how well these assets and skills can be repurposed to serve the enterprise market. Because obviously with enterprise, it consists of managing the needs of multiple customers with different vendor solutions and architectures in place. So it's not clear if operators yet are able to manage multiple bespoke networks on behalf of enterprises. But we're certainly seeing a lot of activity. Some operators are exploring these approaches to offering private networks to broaden the reach of their propositions. So Verizon, for example, has partnered with Celona, a specialist core network vendor, and built a proposition that targets the mid-size enterprise market. And the proposition aims to lower the cost and complexity for that segment. Telefonica plans to operate a separate cloud-based core network, a multi-tenanted network for enterprise use, and that will underpin its hybrid offer. And enterprise customers will be able to choose a sort of full cloud approach or an on-premises hybrid user plane. So there will be different models available. So Telefonica is looking to extend its reach by making different architectures available. And then we see Vodafone is building a management plane to allow customers to monitor and control the network, the devices and the applications on their private network. And it's doing that by adapting its IoT GDSP platform, and that will be the foundation for its management plane. So there's definitely lots of activity and innovation going on to address some of these challenges. The real challenge for operators will be able to prove that they are able to develop a viable hybrid proposition based on their own network assets. They will need to be able to deliver networks to multiple enterprises together with ongoing support to succeed. And of course, they're more of a neutral supplier of technology. They could supply technology from different vendors, and so could provide solutions from different vendors, different cloud providers, at least in theory. Now let's have a look at the public cloud providers. So they have, of course, been very active in the private networks market and have taken many steps to simplify the private networks offer. So they're really looking at how to address the issues of cost and complexity head on. Public cloud providers are working to package the network components with their own cloud and edge computing assets to provide simplified private network solutions to enterprises. They are, to achieve this, some of them have made bold moves to either acquire or partner for some of the network components, especially the core network functions. So we've seen Microsoft, they're integrating some of the core network functions with their edge compute solutions to provide an integrated offer. And they're, of course, using some of the acquisitions they made in that area. AWS is building an ecosystem of partners to achieve the same outcome. They're also looking to reduce the cost of ownership of these networks by providing a range of flexible business models that move away from just the traditional ownership model of CapEx and OpEx model of delivery. What the public cloud providers lack, however, is the sort of systems integration expertise and channel partners that could provide the support to the enterprise users. Because this is still a very, essentially a new and relatively complex network environment. And this is what we see that they lack at this point in time. If we take AWS and take a closer look at what they've been doing, they've probably been the most prominent cloud provider recently in terms of their announcements around private networks. So they're delivering a packaged private 5G solution. They call it 5G. In fact, in the US, where they've announced the launch, it will be 4G initially. And this includes spectrum, CBRS spectrum in the US, the radios, the network hardware with pre-installed software for core network functions, and the SIMs. And the equipment is pre-configured and tested for interoperability. And the solution is designed to be easy to install for the customer and scalable. So the customer can, in theory, add more coverage, capacity, and devices. In terms of the pricing, AWS has simplified the model. It charges $10 per hour for one base station, but customers have to commit for 60 days, which means they pay a minimum cost of $14,400. So presumably that's to cover the upfront costs of the radio network and so on. And thereafter, they may pay some data-related charges. But after that 60 days, they can switch off the equipment when they're not using it. So our initial calculation would suggest it is slightly less expensive than some of the, especially some of the medium and large networks being deployed today. However, the pricing is based on the enterprise using AWS services for everything. So if an enterprise wanted to export the data to another platform or cloud provider, then it becomes a lot more expensive. Analysys Mason did a quick calculation based on the examples provided by AWS. The video stream example shows it costing $7,200 a month if you're using Amazon's video stream service. But for the exact same setup, so 50 cameras streaming 20 megabits for 8 hours per day, it would cost an extra $10,000 a month to export the data to a non-AWS environment. So The pricing is simplified, but there are, of course, pros and cons to it. AWS has not provided any details about its channel strategy, but it's likely to sell directly to enterprises and through channel partners. And it's already named Dish as a partner. AWS has launched the service in the US initially, and it seems that it's likely that many of its partners will be part of the CBRS ecosystem. But if and when it plans to launch in other countries, we assume it will be in those countries such as Germany where industrial spectrum is available. And it could, of course, however, choose to partner with operators as well for their spectrum, and also see them as an important channel to market. But all of that said, AWS's solution is not yet fully commercialized. It's only available in the US market, and we haven't seen any customer announcements yet. So overall, the verdict for the public cloud providers, we believe they will be instrumental in lowering the barriers to adoption for private networks and pushing the market to deliver simpler, affordable solutions. However, they will need to strengthen their channels to provide that ongoing support that enterprises require. And they shouldn't underestimate also the levels of support that might be required in the initial phase of designing and implementing the network. So it's still largely untested in the market. Lots of big announcements, but at the moment we're not seeing an awful lot of commercial activity. And I'll just say a few brief words on the systems integrators. So systems integrators, we're probably not seeing them as active in the private 5G market as we might have expected, but we do think this will change. They are, of course, well placed to reduce complexity. Systems integrators, they're typically reselling the network infrastructure components. They're well placed to address some of the challenges of deploying different network components from different vendors. So they could play a role, for example, excuse me, in making it easier for enterprises to deploy enterprise-ready core network solutions, for example. They're also important channels to market for some of the vendors and could provide enterprises with the ongoing network management support as well as the initial network deployment. And of course, they have expertise in developing and deploying use cases on behalf of the customers. It's questionable, however, to what extent the large systems integrators can simplify solutions at a reasonable cost. They generate revenue from addressing the complexity. So I think there is a question mark there. We've seen considerable interest in the private network propositions from smaller systems integrators. So if you look at the German market, for example, companies like Beifu, M3 Connect, Citycom, which was has since been acquired by Logicalis, all of them were targeting that new opportunity that opened up once industrial spectrum became available. So overall, we expect the systems integrators to play a more important role in this market. They definitely have a role to play in terms of reducing complexity, the support and use cases, but at this point, it's really not clear to what extent they can address the challenges of cost. So just to wrap up, of course, there are many other types of player becoming involved in this market. Enterprise network vendors such as Cisco and HPE, as well as infrastructure companies, Cellnex with its Edzicom acquisition. And we haven't had time to look at them all in this presentation, but they are also all looking at some of these key areas, these key challenges for enterprises when it comes to adoption. We see that suppliers are making some progress in some areas, such as complexity, but perhaps less in others in terms of reducing the cost and so on. And the level of progress really does vary a lot by player. As we can see on this slide, the public cloud providers appear to be ahead in terms of addressing some of these issues. But as I said before, propositions such as those of AWS are still largely untested in the market. We don't have any public references, for example, in our tracker. Even if they do succeed, they're going to need to develop those channels to market and work with other players to deliver that all-important support that enterprises require. Telecoms operators and network equipment providers already have a large share of those 323 networks that I showed at the beginning from the tracker. So they've managed to capture, a large share of the early opportunities in manufacturing, ports, airports, and so on. So I think we will see a lot more progress going forward in terms of addressing these areas of complexity. But for all players, the risk of the market stalling is real. The private networks market will not move beyond those early adopters if these challenges are not addressed. So to wrap up, in terms of recommendations for all suppliers, private network suppliers should reduce complexity for enterprises by delivering integrated solutions that are tailored to enterprise needs. They should deliver segmented and packaged propositions that address the relatively high costs of private networks today. And private network suppliers should help enterprises to identify those all-important use cases, help them source solutions, those use cases that will require a private LTE or 5G network. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll hand back to David at this point.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you to everyone who has attended this session. Before you go, I would just like to remind you that you can still access and download the useful resources. You can still submit a question to Michelle, keeping in mind that Michelle or one of our team will respond to you directly in the coming days. And do feel free to connect with Michelle on LinkedIn and find out more about her and her research via the Analysys Mason website. So now you'll be automatically redirected back to the event homepage, where we would invite you to enjoy another session. We hope you enjoyed this one, and we look forward to welcoming you again soon. Thanks very much.